in a little tent. Like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. It's been too.
Good evening. Welcome to Voting Access and Security, the 10th program in an ongoing series to encourage understanding and discussion about the legacy of race and ethnicity in America and how together we can make changes now for a more just future. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our many community partners, the National Endowment for the Humanities, A More Perfect Union Initiative, and sponsors, the Durango Herald, Ground Floor Media and Center Table, Tate Law, and Arapahoe Libraries. And a big thank you to our presenting partner, the Colorado Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, particularly Jesus Carrillo and Mike Ferrufino, who are helping run the show behind the scenes. I'd also like to recognize the Colorado Humanity Board of Directors and staff on our Changing the Legacy of Race and Ethnicity Committee. A special thank you to Colorado Humanity staff, Linnea Butler, Director of Programs Josephine Jones, and Executive Director Maggie Koval for their commitment in delivering this important programming. Our panelists tonight include Amanda Gonzalez, Jefferson County Clerk and Recorder-elect, Sheila Reiner, Mesa County Election Administrator, and Tanner Lockhead, NAACP Legal Defense Fund Fellow. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this panel, Amber McReynolds. Amber McReynolds is one of the country's leading experts on election administration, policy, and innovation. Amber has dedicated her career to improving the voting process for all, first as an election official, serving as the Director of Elections for the City and County of Denver, Colorado, then as a thought leader and founding CEO for the National Vote at Home Institute and Coalition, and now collaborating and supporting various organizations across the U.S. She is also a governor for the United States Postal Service. She is co-author of the book When Women Vote and is currently serving as a senior strategic advisor to various national organizations, including Issue One, Fair Vote, Election Reformers Network, and others. Amber also served on the Colorado Independent Legislative Redistricting Commission in 2021.
Well, thanks so much, Deb. It's an honor to be here. Thank you to you and the entire team for putting this event together. I'm so excited for the experts that we have here for the panel tonight. And I think the discussion is going to be super great for not only this program, but for all of Colorado and frankly, nationally to talk and hear about these very important issues. I'm going to start out with a couple of questions, but I'd really like all the panelists to when they start answering to introduce yourselves, but also share a little bit about your experience and your background in your first answers, and we will introduce you to the public and get this panel going. So first, I'm going to start with Tanner. So Tanner, given your national perspective and all that you've been doing and working on in various states, including Mississippi and other states around the country, what do you see as the biggest threat to voting rights in this modern era around the country as we're seeing this play out in court cases and also just battles on the ground nationally?
Great. Thank you so much. I'll say to start that it's such an honor to be on this panel joined by so many really, really great and thoughtful experts and folks. So the question is really big, the biggest threat to voting rights. I think it's difficult to talk about the state of voting rights in the United States without thinking about the Supreme Court. So what I might do to frame the conversation is to give a short arc about several cases over the last couple decades that I think really reflect a pretty dangerous project that the Supreme Court has been engaged in undermining voting rights across the United States, and which I think leaves us at a really important inflection point that has big implications on the state and national level for how to move forward. I'm going to try to do that in like 5 minutes, so we'll be quick. But here are my thoughts. I think it's impossible to think about the challenges to voting rights in the United States without first thinking about Shelby County versus Holder, which was a case that LDF argued in 2013. The crown jewel of the civil rights movement in the United States, many folks think, and I agree, was the Voting Rights Act. And the most important part of the Voting Rights Act was Section 5. And Section 5 says that any area with a documented history of voter discrimination, whenever that area has put into effect a rule regarding an election, they have to get that rule pre-cleared by the Justice Department or a federal court. And if that rule has a retrogressive effect, if it harms minority communities, then they don't get permission. And what happened is the Supreme Court, since 1965, that provision had been in effect. And in 2013, the Supreme Court struck it down. And what we saw was a wave of laws across the country that had the effect of suppressing the vote. I think photo ID is a clear example. But one of the things the court said in Shelby County was, look, Section 5 we've struck down, but we still have Section 2, which is the other major provision in the Voting Rights Act that doesn't require pre-clearance, but instead allows voters to sue after the fact. And there are essentially two flavors of Section 2 claims. There's a vote dilution claim, which is mostly about redistricting, and then there's a vote denial claim, mostly about obstacles to voting. Both topics that folks on this panel have deep expertise in. But what I will say is that in Shelby County, they said, you still have Section 2. And then in 2018, 5 years later, the court heard Brnovich versus DNC, and this was a Section 2 vote denial claim. And that involved two state laws out of Arizona that banned out-of-precinct voting and then restricted votes by mail-in ballot. And the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, prohibits laws that have a disproportionate impact on minority communities, which these laws undisputedly did, on Black voters, on Native American voters, on other communities of color. And this really was sort of the quintessential Section 2 vote denial claim. And the holding was that, these laws are fine because it is true that these burdens fall disproportionately on minority communities, but the discrimination in effect can stand as long as it's not too bad, as long as it's not too egregious. And the court, when it says that, says, yeah, sure, we struck down Section 5 in Shelby County, and sure, we've narrowed the scope of vote denial claims, but the other part of Section 2 on vote dilution is still open for folks. And this brings us to this past term in October when the court heard Milligan versus Merrill, which was a vote dilution claim. And Milligan was a challenge to Alabama's congressional redistricting map. 27% of Alabamians are Black, but Black folks make up a majority in only one of 7 congressional districts in Alabama. Black folks are packed and cracked into districts across the state, denying them equal political power to elect candidates of their choice. And since 1986, the Voting Rights Act has said you cannot do that. And it's longstanding precedent. It doesn't matter what the intent of the legislature was when it enacted the map. The question is just, do these maps have the effect of diluting minority voting power? And a 3-judge panel this year, 2 Trump appointees and a Reagan appointee, unanimously agreed that this is like the clearest cut of clear-cut cases. And I think if you ask any voting rights lawyer, they'd say the same thing. And nonetheless, the Supreme Court said, we're not so sure. We're going to take the case. And Alabama's argument in the Supreme Court were really far-reaching. The core of the argument is if you essentially close your eyes to race and were to create 7 random districts, say like by a computer generator, and if that computer generator generated a number of districts, maybe one of 7 districts in which Black people or communities of color constituted a majority, and that happens to be how many districts the legislature in this case drew, then that shows that there was no intentional discrimination on the basis of race. And therefore, there's no Voting Rights Act violation, which is wrong for several reasons. First, that's not the Voting Rights Act standard. And second, even Alabama said, under the existing law, they couldn't prevail, and so essentially asked for the law to be changed, which is not how courts should work. And the way that this matters, I think Justice Kagan lifted up in the argument. She said, she asked Alabama, wouldn't this position be really, really disastrous for minority representation in Congress and across the country? And the response that Alabama gave was, yeah, probably, but so be it, because that's what we think the law has to be. So to recap, Shelby County eliminated Section 5, but says you still have Section 2. Brnovich looked at Section 2, vote denial, and narrowed the scope of that, but said you still have vote dilution claims under Section 2. And then Milligan, which was about vote dilution, we'll see what the outcome is. Hope springs eternal, but it begs the question, what's left? And one important answer to wrap up is state courts and state constitutions, which I think is especially relevant for this conversation. Quickly, you may remember the partisan gerrymandering case in 2018, where the Supreme Court said, partisan gerrymandering is not illegal because federal courts don't have the capacity to deal with it. But in Rucho, the court said, don't worry, because state constitutions, state courts can still ban partisan gerrymandering, so go take your claim to state court. And that is exactly what happened in North Carolina, which brings us to Moore v. Harper, which I think is one of the most consequential cases that the court is going to hear potentially in a long time, and it'll be argued on December 7th. And in North Carolina, there was an egregious partisan gerrymander by the North Carolina state legislature. There was a lawsuit to stop it. The North Carolina Supreme Court agreed, said it violated the state constitution. And then the state legislature appealed and said, essentially, their argument is state courts cannot enforce state constitutions when it involves federal elections. The legislatures can do what they want. And the basic argument comes from a provision of the US Constitution saying that the time, place, and manner of federal elections will be made by the legislature. They interpret that word really narrowly. This is the independent state legislature theory. And there are a number of doctrinal and jurisdictional problems with that, which we don't really need to get into. But the core of the issue is that this is a really important threat, I would argue, to the separation of powers, but also to voting rights more generally. And I think where that leaves us is, I said at the beginning, at the outset, that we're at an inflection point. And I think the takeaway is it's a really precarious moment for multiracial democracy in America. And I think as civil rights litigators, of course, we're not giving up on the courts, right? There are really important bright spots and sources of hope. But I think the reality is that the progressive movement, folks who are interested in access, communities of color, need to think more expansively beyond federal courts, beyond litigation, about protecting the vote. And that's where I think the expertise of this panel is so critical. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Tanner. So much knowledge in that one answer, and thank you for sharing those case examples of what's been before the Supreme Court, what those actions have been, because it's so important as we consider what's happening at the state level and in various states around the country, as we talk about these issues, and also just consider what the ramifications are for various changes. So I want to turn to Sheila, and I think Amanda might also have a perspective on this. But one of the things that Tanner mentioned was the idea of voter registration. Namely, one of the cases relates to out of precinct voters, and that was the one in Arizona. And one of the things that Colorado did specifically back in 2013 was create and frankly get rid of the outdated deadlines around registering to vote, but also changing your address. And that basically eliminated the out of precinct voters, because we created vote centers, and we also allowed for people to change their address and also register to vote on election day. And Colorado does that, Minnesota does that. All the top 10 states for turnout have some form of modern voter registration, including changing addresses. And when we made that change in 2013, it did a number of things. And so, Sheila, I want to turn to you on this, because one of the big things that is never talked about with our model in Colorado is the significant benefit of the modernizations around voter registration, eliminating the deadlines, which really are not new registrants coming in to vote, but it's more people changing their addresses, which has been the biggest impact. We reduced provisional ballots in a significant way. I think the number is around 93% was the reduction in provisionals, saved the state a ton of money, but also eliminated this very issue that Tanner brought up about out of precinct voters. So I ask you, what are those changes that were made in 2013? How have we seen the impact? has it been a partisan impact, or has it helped all voters across the state? And what are your perspectives about that change that happened now almost 10 years ago?
Thanks, Amber. Sheila Reiner. I am currently a Mesa County election administrator. I'm not in the role of clerk and recorder any longer. I'm the former clerk and recorder, but I have over 20 years of experience in election conduct. And this change that Amber alluded to in the state of Colorado happened in 2013. And I was fortunate enough to be at the table during those negotiations when we brought those laws forward and literally created the Colorado election model that we enjoy today. And around that particular issue of, it was a same-day voter registration model and allowed changes, as Amber mentioned, all the way through election day. As an election administrator, that scared me to death. And I can bet that many election administrators in these other states where this idea might be brought up are going to put on the brakes, because it is very scary to think about it as an election administrator, how many ballots you're going to have to prepare for each precinct. You come into this with years and years of processes and procedures in place where you know how many voters are in each precinct, you know about how many are going to show up, you are prepared, you have enough people at each one of the polling locations. And to open it up like this was a huge step, but it reaped so many benefits, not only for the voters, but also for the election administrators. We weren't fighting anymore over when someone turned in a form, or if they made a particular deadline, or if they lived in the jurisdiction that they were trying to vote in time. And, you know, the biggest thing that sold me on it as an election administrator and trying to bridge that gap between practical process and procedure and the fundamental rights of someone who's voting is that in order for them to vote on the issues that matter to them right now on that day, we needed to allow them to update their address and give them an updated ballot style. And, you know, part of that was getting away from the precinct regiments and moving into a model where we could provide the service to any voter anywhere in that county. And so I guess for an administrator, not only was it great for our Colorado voters and eliminated a lot of problems, it also alleviated a lot of stress off of the administration.
Thank you for that, Sheila. And also, I know one of the data points from 2014, which was the first midterm and first general election that was implemented, the numbers speak for themselves. So when we talk about whether or not these models and things like same-day registration benefit Republicans or Democrats or a third party, what we found in Colorado in 2014 is that Republicans and Democrats basically had an even number of people that utilized same-day registration on the day of the election. Independents had a slightly higher number, but ultimately it benefited all voters across the state in every corner of the state in a very significant way. And so this reform, even just this one piece, same-day registration and modernizing voter registration deadlines, has been it's been put in this partisan fight unnecessarily, because it just benefits everyone, and also people don't check to whether or not there's an election coming up to determine if they're going to move for a job or for other things. So is that what you're from Mesa, and that's the western side of the state. I mean, is that something that you continue to see, is that these reforms that were passed in 2013 benefit all, regardless of party affiliation? You continue.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Thank you for hitting on that point. I missed it in my first response, but absolutely, we continue to see that. And what was so revealing in those 2014 midterm elections were the actual party that fought against those reforms, which is my party, actually benefited the more. I believe, if I remember correctly, the statistics actually said that there were more Republicans that changed their address late. And a few more Republicans that registered same-day voter registration than Democrats, and they did very well in that midterm. So it wasn't about the process.
It just was a policy designed to put voters first, regardless of who you pick on your
That's
ballot.
right.
So Amanda, I want to bring you into this conversation. Congratulations, newly elected clerk and recorder in Jefferson County, Colorado, one of the biggest counties and jurisdictions in Colorado, and former executive director, I should say, of Colorado Common Cause. So you've worked on these issues for a number of years. You've been on the advocacy side. Now you're coming into an election administration role. Would love to hear from you how you see your new role in relation to the work that you've done previously, and what you think Colorado can improve upon, given that it is considered one of the models around the country. What are the things that you see that could be made better going forward?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so good to see everybody. And I want to touch a little bit on the question that we were discussing before, because as you mentioned, I was a longtime advocate, and in 2012, I was a volunteer attorney with the state's nonpartisan election protection effort. And I will tell you, the most heartbreaking calls that we got were people on election day saying, can I still register to vote? And often these were people in more rural counties. I think that as people that kind of live and breathe this work, we're acutely aware of how many elections are coming up and when they're coming. But for many, many people that, are just trying to work their job and feed their kids and get everybody to school on time, they may not realize there's an election coming up until a week before or the day of. And so I thought that was really important. And then in 2013, I was actually the executive director of the Colorado Latino Leadership Advocacy and Research Organization, GLADO, which is the state's largest Latino advocacy group. And I love my folks, but I'm late to everything. And we also know that that these laws have historically had a disproportionate impact on people of color and other racialized people. I think we've talked a bit on this panel about modernizing elections. And I think models like the one that Colorado adopted in 2013, and I'm so grateful to everybody who's on this call who worked on that, I think they really actually reflect our modern lives, right? The reality is many of us move every year, and we need to make sure that that isn't getting in the way of people having a voice in their elections and in the policies that ultimately affect their everyday lives. And so, to get back to your question, as the incoming clerk in Jefferson County, I am so excited to continue to make our elections actually work for everyday folks, right? And we know that voter behavior changes, we know that technology changes, we know that those things will continue to evolve, and election administrators are going to need to continue to evolve in order to meet voters where they are.
That's so great, putting voters first and meeting them where they are in their everyday lives. I mean, that's definitely the Colorado way, and other states have followed along. I should say, and just note this before I go on to some questions, Colorado has consistently been in the top 2, within the top 5 for sure, but in the top 2 of states in terms of turnout. For some reason, we can't get beyond Minnesota. Maybe that'll happen in 2024. But we're always within about 0.5% of Minnesota in terms of turnout. But Colorado and Minnesota continue to be at the top, and Colorado has gained that position after reforming our laws to meet people where they are, as Sheila and Amanda both stated. So on to a few more questions to kind of frame this conversation. Sheila, I want to go back to you on an issue, and Amanda, you might also have perspective on this. Tanner, you also might want to weigh in on this. One of the big themes in 2022 that was coming before election officials was a significant increase in open records requests coming into local officials around the country using FOIA at the federal level, or in Colorado's context, the CORA, which is the Colorado Open Records Request. It was being weaponized, and This was a documented story. Reuters did an article on it. CNN covered it. It's been covered all the way going back to February 2022, all the way through September and October of this year, where we continued to see this huge influx of open records requests into county officials. And it was bogging down operations, and county officials didn't even have enough resources and responses to respond to all of these records requests. So I want to ask you, what are your concerns? How do you see this going forward in terms of the overwhelming nature of that on resources at the county level? How does that impact counties? What could be changed in the laws to sort of address the weaponization that's happened with some of these issues? And then how do you see this impact on election security broadly?
Thanks, Amber. That's a tricky one because as an election official, you want to be transparent and you want to provide people access to their records because it literally is the people's elections. And at the same time, when you have this barrage of open records requests coming in while you're trying to conduct an election, it is absolutely overwhelming. By the law, you have 72 hours to get an initial response back to each person who's requesting records or essentially asking questions and requesting records at the same time. And so it is overwhelming. And I think the only thing that we can do as an election professional is prepare for those. Some of the counties in Colorado have proactively begun redacting personally identifying information off of ballot images just after elections are over so that those records are available. And when the request comes in, they can be provided timely. But another issue that we would face with that is unauthorized people doing audits. And I think we saw a little bit of that after the 2020 election across the nation, where people were deriving the data they wanted to find in order to make conclusions that may not have been correct. So what a balance to be had there. Access versus validity. I don't know.
And I will say, and actually another election official in another state referred to it in this manner, but they basically equated it to a denial of service attack, which, if you know cybersecurity, to the public that's watching, cybersecurity issues, denial of service attack basically takes down your whole system by flooding you with various nefarious interactions and just bogging down the system so that the servers don't work and there's no responsiveness. And in a way, this is almost like a denial of service attack, but in a physical way. And what we saw was a number of these requests were repetitive across the country. They were copy and paste kind of submittals. So Tanner, I don't know if you had any interaction with any election officials on this, or if you've seen this come up, but this certainly has been impacting states and election officials. And I'm just curious if you've seen this come up in the legal legal parameters around what could potentially be done or what solutions might exist to prevent something like this in the future.
Yeah, it's a super good question. And it brings to mind a really significant issue we saw in Mississippi in 2022 related to these public records requests, where there is a lot of ambiguity, for example, in the Mississippi statutes about the ways in which election officials have to report polling site changes to the Secretary of State. And in Mississippi, basically, there's different levels of election officials, and the law isn't clear about who has to report them when, which leads to a lot of misinformation, and folks don't know where to vote. This is like a long-standing issue. And one of the ways that advocacy groups attempt to help voters is to issue these public records requests to put that information together in a way that's accessible for voters. Which is fine, and it doesn't speak to the issue that you named, which is the weaponization of these FOIAs and state FOIA analog requests. But I think it suggests two things. The first thing is that Those superfluous, excessive requests bog down election administrators attempting to respond to requests that like do actually support and increase access. And the second thing is that when you design state and federal law in a thoughtful and clear way, you can head off some of this. I mean, you can't head off the weaponization, but you can like preempt some of the issues that that folks from, at least in our case, the NAACP, ACLU, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, we're doing across the country. So that's what I'd say on public records, because you're right, it's just a super hard trade-off. I think I would sort of open up the conversation about the way that sort of law has structured access to elections in a couple ways. In Mississippi, for example, which is where I did my most recent work, I named polling site changes. That's a barrier voters face due to statutory ambiguity, just like bad drafting and some confusion. Election cybersecurity is also important. The Secretary of State's website went down on election day, like it just crashed. Largely, well, who knows why, but the reporting is that there was potentially a cyber attack. So election security and cybersecurity is really important. And then there's a host of other election administration issues. It's not election administration issue, but broader election issues like state laws on early voting periods. Mississippi doesn't have early voting at all. Really restrictive mail-in voting regulations, strict photo ID requirements. I mentioned restrictions on out-of-precinct voting in the Arizona Brnovich case, but in Mississippi, there's also really, really stringent out-of-precinct voting requirements. And I think the consequence is that a lot of voters experience confusion. They're just trying to live their lives, right? And then it turns out that one of these barriers just turns out to be too much. Long lines on election day. I think we should also name the sort of national climate and the way that it's affected poll workers and poll worker shortages, right? Folks who are nervous about their safety and security, which results in folks not having the capacity to staff polling sites in some cases, which leads to long lines. And that I think is nationwide as well. All of these raise potential legislative fixes, and some of them you just, it's hard to legislate around. You just have to adapt in the ways that y'all named, especially with respect to these public records requests.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Mississippi, because I want to interject a data point here. So Mississippi, Tennessee, and West Virginia are always basically fighting for who's going to have the lowest turnout in the country. And I should say, when people talk about elections and comparing states and federalism, and our whole election model is built on states making choices about policies. Consistently, the top 10 states for turnout are pretty much always the same, and the bottom 10 states for turnout are pretty much always the same. And they all have consistent policies in place, whether that's long voter registration windows where there's huge cutoffs for when people can register to vote, or the lack of early voting, or the lack of access to a mail ballot. And so, I call that out because turnout obviously matters to some people in terms of a metric, but it does seem to demonstrate a trend in terms of where states are from a policy perspective. And when we have federal elections and we have this massively different trajectory of how state laws work, it's confusing to the public. It seems to create a breeding ground for mis and disinfo to spread rampantly, because we have such differences by state in even a federal cycle. So it seems like there's opportunities on the cybersecurity front, on the physical security front, on the policy front to address some of those things as well. Sheila and Amanda, I'd love you to weigh in on, so what Tanner just brought up, a number of different issues, including the poll worker shortage issue, which Colorado has not seen the same trajectory in terms of shortages as other states have. But what ideas do each of you have to bring more people in to serve as poll workers? Do you think that's an important issue in terms of educating the public? What ideas do you see going forward to encourage more people to come into the fold of serving as an election official during an election?
So as you all were actually talking around the last question, one of the things that I was thinking about, Amber, as you were talking about the difference in policy across different states, is that these policies are actually not race neutral, right? Our country has a long history of the way that these laws have specifically impacted Black people and other people of color. And for a very long time, we have had white supremacy masquerading as democracy. And so I think it's important to have that frame top of mind as well, because, we are not fighting a new fight. And in some ways, I think that actually really gives me hope. I was an election judge in, I don't know, right when I'd moved to Colorado. So I was in my 20s, and it like really restored my faith in our ability to work together. If you want to feel better about elections, come be an election judge in Colorado, because almost everything is done in bipartisan teams. And so I was working with people that, I probably see the world a little bit differently from. And at the end of the day, I had so much respect because they were just doing the same thing that I was doing, which was trying to make our democracy as strong as it can possibly be. I had a volunteer on my most recent campaign, and she said that, in the last election, she was an election judge, and she actually became friends with a person of a different party that she was picking up ballots with, and they now go on walks once a week. And so that actually gives me a lot of hope. The other thing that I think is really important is that we need all different kinds of people who are in these roles, right? Our life experience absolutely matters. I am somebody who usually goes and votes in person, and I usually try to test the system. I bring a non-traditional ID. And in 2018, when I went to vote, the vote center closest to me happened to also share an office with the police department. So you had to walk through the police department to get there. And the gentleman who was helping me, to give him grace, like, I'm sure he meant no malice, right? But he got a little flustered because he couldn't immediately find me in the system. And he said, why don't you just re-register to vote? I said, I don't have the proper kind of ID for that. And in his flustered state, he ended up shouting, saying loud enough for people to turn their heads, are you even a citizen? And it took my breath away a little bit. And I was somebody who was running the state's largest nonpartisan election protection effort, right? And I tell that story to highlight the importance of having great training, and we really do throughout Colorado, and having all different kinds of people who are helping run our elections, because we want to make sure that all voters feel safe and welcome and included.
What I have found as we've led teams of election judges throughout the years is everybody that I have ever had in have had their heart in the right place when they come to serve as an election judge. And they may not always get it right, as the example that you just gave, Amanda, but they do have their heart in the right place, and it's a camaraderie thing, and it is an integrity thing. And I've had very few negative experiences, with the people who have come in to help with elections. And I think maybe one of the reasons Colorado is hanging on to our election officials the way we are, even through this terrible time that we've been through recently, is that the laws are pretty straightforward. We are meeting the voters where they are. We don't have to have a ton of fights over whether or not someone is eligible, because it's pretty easy to register and to cast that vote in Colorado. And maybe that's one of the differences as to why we're retaining them.
Yeah, it seems like when you have a better customer experience, whether it's in business or in government or in voting, if the customer is experiencing something better, the administrators are naturally going to experience a better process, and there's going to just be less controversy because it's straightforward. To your point, Sheila, the laws are clear. but also we've really mitigated a lot of the risks that existed in the system previously, and it is far more straightforward than it ever was before. So certainly that's a lesson I think in other states can look at, like, this is not partisan. It's really about operational efficiency and effectiveness. And if we can focus people on that, it seems like we'd be able to advance more improvements overall, like what we've seen in Colorado. Okay, so I want to, well, all three of you might want to weigh in on this, but Tanner, as you outlined a number of issues that have come up in the Supreme Court with regards to the Voting Rights Act. And one of the things I wanted to ask all of you is the Voting Rights Act specifically outlined states for pre-clearance. So not all states were universally covered in the same way that the pre-clearance standards were set forth in the Voting Rights Act as drafted. And one of the things the John Lewis Voting Rights Act did, which was the sort of newer version last year that was moving through Congress, was there was a deal made to apply the Voting Rights Act and that pre-clearance notion to all states equally. And this is something that I know I've talked about for many years, to say, well, obviously all states should be covered, because there's a number of states that were never covered under pre-clearance. New York is a great example, that had less access than a number of other states that were covered. And it created this kind of odd balance between the states, where some states were covered, some weren't, some should have been, some weren't. So I'd love all of you to weigh in on whether or not, that kind of national policy to, require states to live under those pre-clearance conditions, or live under some set of conditions that is universal and equal, if you think that would improve the voting process for all across the country, and also just some of the litigious nature of how elections have moved in the last few years in terms of a lot of litigation and cases around them. So Tanner, why don't you answer first, and then we'll open it to Amanda and Sheila.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think I agree for two reasons. I think first, because I think it is certainly true that there are jurisdictions pre-Shelby County, when pre-clearance was in effect, that should have been covered and were not. It's also true that the Voting Rights Act, before Section 5 was struck down, had a provision whereby jurisdictions that were covered, meaning had like a history of, there's several metrics, but basically had a history of really restrictive voting laws and a history of voting discrimination, particularly against Black folks concentrated in the Southeast, that they could get uncovered, that if they complied with federal law, if they did not act in a way that had the effect of discriminating against communities of color, then they were clear. And I think under this national model, right, I think it's good that it is over-inclusive. I think we should err towards over-inclusivity here instead of under-inclusivity. I think a provision where jurisdictions who do a good job can have a little more latitude makes sense. I think it's likely that given this Supreme Court an approach that covers the whole country equally as opposed to particular jurisdictions, it likely stands a better chance of passing legal muster, although, who knows. I would also add, kind of to conclude, that there are states who have taken it upon themselves to adopt statewide voting rights acts that do the same thing. And I think New York State's a really good example where you're exactly right. There's a history in New York as well of racially discriminatory voting laws. And New York said this past year in their new Voting Rights Act, I think also called the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York, that all jurisdictions in New York will be covered by a version of pre-clearance. And I just think it's really smart. I would also say that the reason why pre-clearance is so effective is because it places the burden on governments, not on private plaintiffs, and not on individual voters to spend money to fix these issues, right? It is fundamentally the obligation of governments to make sure that voting processes are open and equal, even though that's hard. And it also means that when a voting law or regulation is discriminatory, that it can be addressed beforehand. You don't have to wait for the effect in order to have standing to sue in court. And this is what Congress recognized when it passed the Voting Rights Act. It's something the Supreme Court did not sort of give much credit to when it decided Shelby County in 2013, but I do think that pre-clearance makes a lot of sense. But those are my hot takes. I'm not sure if others agree. But it also is a burden on state election administrators at a time in which folks are stretched really thin, and I think that's important to lift up too.
I mean, the big message, right, is that it basically says submit your plan and we'll make sure it complies, rather than after the fact and you're in litigious situations trying to fight it out. So Sheila, what is your perspective on this? Like, how do you see this?
Yeah, my gut gives some resistance to it, actually. As an election administrator, I think, how would I feel about that? Especially if I'm doing just fine. And it seems like it could tamper down a jurisdiction's ability to innovate and be creative and do our own thing, which election administrators are protective of. And so all states are in a little bit of a different place, and the jurisdictions within those states are as well. So a blanket type policy just gives me a little bit of hesitance, because in a state where you're used to mail ballot voting, let's say, for instance, and a state that rarely uses mail ballots, some sort of a blanket policy or mandate could be harmful in the end.
So you'd want to have something that rewards innovation and creativity to improve the process, but also, holds jurisdictions accountable that maybe aren't living up to where they should be or where the voters would expect them to be, or has long lines or has other barriers that might sort of create an obstacle for voters. But you really want to make sure that there's preservation around jurisdictions that can innovate and continue to move forward and not be constricted by some sort of limitation at the federal level in terms of that pre-clearance program.
Yes, that's a decent recap, but also not forced to move too quickly, because I think that's when mistakes can be had. And we can find ourselves in legal trouble, not intentionally, but because we weren't ready for that next innovation or that next mandate without just the groundwork being laid and education being had.
And states vary. Alaska's needs are very different than California's needs, as I've just been experiencing and helping out in Alaska. Amanda, what is your perspective and take on this topic?
Yeah, I think Sheila's point is well taken. I think that narrow one-size-fits-all solutions, are rarely the right pick. That being said, post-Shelby, we saw partisan politicians throughout the country adding new voting restrictions like strict voter ID, rollbacks of early and mail-in voting, in some cases even trying to pull eligible voters off voter rolls. And these, unjust, racist, anti-voter policies, they really need to be stopped before they take effect. And I think that measures like restoring pre-clearance would go a long way. I also think that with my advocacy hat on, we never wanted to come across issues while the election was already going, right? While early voting was already going, while God forbid, the last day of the election. Right? We wanted to find that stuff earlier so that we could work with clerks and other election administrators to get it figured out before voting started and before it impacted voters. And so from that perspective, I think some version of pre-clearance is actually really important.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I have a couple more questions, and we're going to kind of do this as a round. So Amanda, I'm going to start with you on this first. It's the first second to last question, I guess I should say. So, and this will be for all of you. We'll do a little bit of a round robin here, but what is your biggest concern ahead of 2024? And then the second sort of wave of that will be, how do you, what do you think could address that concern going forward? So Amanda, we'll start with you on what's your biggest concern ahead of 2024?
I continued to be really worried about mis and disinformation. I think that we fundamentally need everyone to trust our elections and be involved. Our democracy is stronger when everybody participates, and I think mis and disinformation only serve to suppress the vote and keep people away. And so that's what's on my mind going into 2024.
Okay, and Sheila.
Going into 2024, I think that the biggest challenge that election administrators have in front of them is maintaining that integrity and the line that we have with our public, and not letting that misinformation and disinformation be louder than the messages that we provide the voters that has good information in it. So I'm kind of with Amanda on that one.
Awesome, thank you. And Tanner, what is your biggest concern going into 2024?
I might cheat and say too. I think the first is the Voting Rights Act and the condition of the Voting Rights Act, particularly in Merrill v. Milligan, and what it's going to look like for redistricting, especially after the most recent census. I also think Moore v. Harper. I am concerned that a world in which state courts can't check partisan state legislatures. I think that is a world that is really bad for democracy, and certainly multiracial democracy. And then finally, I think related to mis and disinformation is, I think, just generally public trust in the election process, right? The sense that the person who got the most votes, as counted by election officials, won and should concede when that happens, is a basic principle of living in a democratic system. And I think those views are informed by mis and disinformation. And so maybe that's the root of it. But I think faith in the integrity of our elections and fidelity to that, even when you lose, is something that I will be. I'm nervous to see how that plays out in 2024.
So thank you for all those great answers. And I guess on the final point that you just made, Tanner, I mean, one of the jobs of election officials is to not only announce the winner of the election, but convince the loser they lost. And I know Sheila and I have had a number of conversations about this. And I know, Amanda, you have also conversed with a number of election officials around the country. What do you think can be done between now and 2024 to, number one, better educate the public about the election processes, but number two, address this very important issue of convincing losers they lost, explaining the process to them, doing whatever we can to get in front of that mis and disinfo. So I guess overall, what are the solutions? What are your ideas going into 2024 to try to address these very significant issues before us?
Who do you want to go first?
Sheila, you can go first. Amanda went first last time.
One of the things that I can think of is just being ready with that information. You know, I mentioned earlier how one thing election officials can do is get ahead of those FOIA requests or CORA requests. And if we have literally the ballot images ready to go in a timely manner after the election to provide the proof that the loser lost and the winner won, that'd be one thing that we could do proactively.
Amanda, what are your thoughts, given you're, from the outside now coming into the office? I'm sure you have a lot of ideas about what you might want to try.
Yeah, well, outside of what I want to try, I would love to see our social media platforms take a much stronger stance on getting rid of mis and disinformation much more quickly than we've seen in the past. I think one of the things that I learned through, campaigning on a pretty local level is, these are our neighbors, these are our friends, these are not mystery bots for the most part that are like behind a screen. And so I even found that through the course of the campaign, talking to your local PTA and your local Rotary Club, they see that their election administrator, their future elections administrator, is their neighbor, is a normal person, is somebody that's not a wizard behind the scenes trying to do bad things. And I do think that connection and building trust is really, really helpful. I think in our world, we talk a lot about trusted messengers. There's a lot to that, but one of the things is just getting to know somebody as a human. And so my hope is that over the next couple of years, I think that clerks have done an excellent job in Colorado of doing that. And I think we've got 2 more years to make it even stronger.
That's great. And, both of you brought up that this is really a local phenomenon, and elections are run at the local level. It is election judges that are our neighbors and our friends, and even the officials like yourselves are part of the community. And it seems like telling that story more and more, going deep into the community, as both of you mentioned, PTA meetings and other meetings that happen within the community are really important ahead of 2024, just to explain these issues, answer the questions. And it seems like that's going to be a big focus of not only the clerks in Colorado, but the clerks nationally ahead of 2024 to get in front of some of these issues. Tanner, so another, I guess, series of questions I'm going to ask you all. So from your perspective, and you've talked a little bit about the litigation and some of the cases that have come up. So what could be better? Like, if you had a magic wand and you can make elections and you can improve elections and some of the issues we've talked about tonight across the country, what is that list of things that you would want to do?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So, I think that there are a couple things, but I think that pre-clearance makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'd like to see that happen. I think folks have lifted up approaches we can take to tampering down mis and disinformation. I think more robust public education campaigns, all of those are things that don't require legislatures to do. Well, some of them in different ways. I think when you sort of take a multi-pronged approach to democracy promotion work, I think that approach is necessary, and it requires folks from all sides. So I think it looks like, again, legislative change, pre-clearance. I think you can have more robust and clear statutory rules. You could, the Electoral Count Act, fixing the role of the vice president in election certification, I think would be a really big improvement. But conversations like this, meetings door to door, conversations with neighbors, spreading information about the ways in which local election officials are just doing a good job and doing an honest job, I think is really important. So, it's a hard question. I don't know that there's a single fix, but I think that's because democracy promotion work is something that necessarily requires advocacy from all fronts. And I think, if anything, I'm sure that answer isn't very satisfying, but what I think it should do is give us hope and energy around the capacity that all of us have to engage in some part of this work. And I think if that's the takeaway, then that's a really important thing to leave the conversation with.
Thank you so much. And so Amanda and Sheila, if you can do 1, you can do 2, you can do 3, but what are your top ideas for how Colorado can get even better in terms of election administration going forward? Let's start with Amanda this time, since Amanda, you're the newly elected clerk in one of the biggest counties. I'm sure you have a number of ideas, and I think the public would love to hear them.
Yeah, I am really looking forward to updating and increasing our engagement and outreach. I think that if I got my magic wand, I would make elections as easy to understand and as accessible as Facebook, right? Like, I would love it to just be on everybody's, not elections themselves, but the understanding of how the process works, to just like be with you all the time on your phone. I think a great example is Sheila brought up, so-called audits. I want to put that in air quotes, that people are wanting to dig up information that doesn't exist, but they would like to believe into existence. Colorado was one of the first states in the nation to do risk limiting audits. They're really easy to understand. They're transparent. I think Arapahoe County actually put theirs live on Facebook. It was incredibly boring streaming. But I think that level of transparency is fantastic. And I wish that more people, had room in their lives to understand that in a deep way, because I think they would be more trusting and more engaged. And so, yeah, I'm really excited about helping to make that happen in people's lives.
Thank you for that.
That's awesome.
It's really about making it more accessible, making it boring, which, a lot of this stuff is pretty boring to watch, especially audits, but making it more accessible just for anybody that wants to jump in, and they can view it at their fingertips, and they can see the information and learn about it. One thing before you answer, so one of the things that Nebraska does, which they're the only state in the country that does this, they basically treat election judges and poll workers as if it's jury duty. So you're assigned, and there's various ways you can defer to the next time, but they basically circulate amongst the entire population in Nebraska, serving as election judges and poll workers. And I throw that out there to ask you, especially Sheila, given that you've run elections for so many years, is that the kind of idea? Are those the sorts of innovations that we need to be thinking about? How do we consider things like that for voters future voters, I should say, under the age of 18 that can serve in Colorado, 16, 17? Should we create some programs around being poll workers and improving the pipeline of folks coming into the field and serving in that way? Would that help education? So I'll turn that over to you with that potential idea from Nebraska, and maybe other ideas that you might have.
That would be cool. That would be really cool, especially if we could catch young adults when they're coming into this, just into the voting process, make it some sort of a mandatory class, if you will. That's a great idea. I would wonder if their heart would be in it. So that's one of the things that, I talked about earlier, is that usually the people that we have, their heart is in it. And that's what makes it go so well. So I don't know about the requirement and that actually happening organically for people. I think one of the other things that we can do is just continue to be very bold with our message on how elections work, and what the facts are, and continue to battle that misinformation very timely and succinctly, to the best of our ability. And the election officials and election judges and lawmakers who are supporting the election efforts are all going to have to be supported, and just be there for each other and watch each other's backs throughout the next few years.
Finally, for all the panelists, what gives you hope not only about this upcoming year and the election process that just happened in 2022, but also looking at 2024 and frankly beyond 2024? What gives you hope? What are you excited about? What are you looking for to see over the next few years from either voting law changes or the voting populace? Just overall, what is giving you hope these days with regards to all the challenges we have before us?
There are a couple things that come to mind. The first is legislation. I think there's a good chance that we might see reform to the Electoral Count Act. That's a cause for celebration and optimism, I think, for everyone. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, I think, contains a lot of really promising fixes at a federal level for some of the erosion of voting rights we've seen, particularly at the Supreme Court. I think the reinvigoration of the Justice Department and combating voter suppression is really promising. At the state level, the New York Voting Rights Act is really excellent. 12 states have enacted laws to expand the right to vote since 2020. Of course, many other states have gone the other direction, but there's hope there. A second is, I think, what this moment clarifies is there needs to be an increased focus, I think, on the role of organizing and power building, particularly at a local level, over the role of federal courts. And I think this moment clarifies that there is a critical role for everyone to play, and not just attorneys, right? Through legislation, through volunteering to be an election worker, through combating mis and disinformation, like talking to your friends. I think this panel is a really powerful example, building community and knowledge in service of those values. I think that's the path forward, and there's cause for optimism there. I also think two more things. One is an awareness about modern day voter suppression, right? I think that's important on its own terms, but also because I think folks are more aware of it, and that gives a lens into other more subtle and facially neutral ways in which particularly communities of color across the country have been harmed. And I think that lens has educated folks about how structural racism in particular works, not just in elections, but across the board. And then finally, I think that there is a lot of hope to be found in an increased consciousness about voting rights and participation, right? This is top of mind for a lot of people in a way that it has not been in a long time. If you look at election, like exit polls, right, concerns about democracy itself drove turnout. And that's actually a very remarkable thing. 2020 had the biggest turnout of an election in the United States ever during a pandemic. That itself was on the heels of the largest civil rights demonstration in our country's history, right? The summer before. You can look at participation in the Georgia runoff in 2020. Youth participation is super high. I mean, I think that there are really important reasons to be confident. And then the last thing I'd say goes back to a point Amanda made, which is that American democracy is really young. We were not a real democracy until 1954, I think at the earliest with Brown, really 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. So I think of if American democracy was a person, it would be sort of like a moody teenager, right? You're just sort of starting to figure out what it's like to be a real, mature, multiracial democracy with all of those growing pains. And I think that sense of youth, right, and of newness should give us perspective and also hope that we have the capacity to mature and to change. And I think there's a lot of cause for hope there.
I'm very hopeful that technology and records and processes and solid procedures will prevail. With 2020, the democracy in the United States withstood its hardest test for sure to date. And, there was nothing that came forward that shook the actual results from that election. And that speaks volumes. And it can only get stronger. And so as we face these struggles and these challenges, I'm hopeful that our system and our belief in that system just grows.
And I think a lot of what we saw in 2020 was a very noisy, but actually relatively small group of people who really want to erode our democracy. That just isn't most people, right? And my campaign, in part, gave me hope. So everybody, I'm a Democrat, but everybody in my family is a Republican. And my dad was a huge fan of Rush Limbaugh. And he believes that the 2020 election was correctly and accurately decided. He actually helped me collect signatures on my campaign. I told him I was going to out him to all his Republican friends. And in the last days of the election, when I was phone banking, we had this group of volunteers, and my youngest volunteer was 13 years old. My oldest volunteer in that room that day was 87. And we had Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated people all just calling to get up the vote. And so, I know that our communities are good. I know that we want our democracy to be strong. And, I have some worries about the Supreme Court, and I have some stuff that keeps me up at night. But at the end of the day, most people are going to participate in our democracy, and they're going to make sure that we continue to get this right. So I know we can do it.
So thank you all for your incredible perspectives tonight for this amazing event. Thank you all for sharing what gives you hope. I think it's important that we always keep focused on not only the challenges of the day, but what we're also hopeful about and what we're excited about going forward. The future of Colorado and the voting rights and access that we have, along with the election security issues, including our leading efforts on advanced auditing in the country, are all something that I think the collective universe of Coloradans are very proud of, and certainly the election officials continue to be proud of. And we continue to lead the nation. And it seems to me that continuous improvement has put us there, and we need to make sure we continuously stay on the forefront of not only innovations around elections, but also access and security, and ensuring the proper balance of all of those perspectives across the domain of how we run elections in this country. And Colorado has a lot to be proud of in terms of not only being a high turnout state, but just overall having a healthy civic domain and also democracy in our state. Hopefully we can continue to all collectively look for ways to improve that even further and take it to the next level and make sure that our children and our grandkids and everyone that comes after them have a solid and safe, secure, accessible voting process for all future years to come. So with that, we'll close out tonight's event, and thank you to all of our amazing panelists for being here. And I will turn it back to Deb with Colorado Humanities.
Thank you, panelists, for sharing your knowledge and insights to help us better understand the issues with voting and elections in our state and around the country. Please visit the Colorado Humanities website, coloradohumanities.org, where you will find resources related to this program and links to view Changing the Legacy of Race and Ethnicity programs about education, housing, equitable healthcare, and more on our Facebook and YouTube channels. We are happy to offer facilitated community conversations about these topics and those of concern in your community next January through April 2023. Thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities sustaining the humanities through the American Rescue Plan funding. To partner in a community conversation intended to help groups bridge divides of understanding in your community, please email info@coloradohumanities.org for more information. Thank you again to our sponsors and partners, and thank you for attending our program.